There are moments in life when a person speaks with so much confidence, so much cruelty, and so much certainty that they never stop to imagine what will happen if they are wrong. On the night Sterling Global Innovations celebrated 15 years of dominance, Terrence Sterling made that mistake in front of an entire ballroom. The Grand Meridian Hotel glittered with gold chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the kind of expensive elegance designed to impress people who were already used to being impressed. Every table was dressed in white linen and crystal. Every guest looked carefully chosen. Men wore tailored tuxedos. Women moved through the room in designer gowns that shimmered beneath the warm light. Waiters in white gloves floated between tables with trays of champagne. The soft hum of money, power, and reputation filled the room before a single speech had even begun. Sterling Global had become one of the most talked-about tech companies in the industry. 15 years earlier, it had begun as a bold idea. Now it was worth $65 billion and had offices in multiple countries, powerful investors, and a reputation for innovation that made competitors nervous. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of vision, achievement, and legacy. And in the eyes of nearly everyone in that room, that legacy belonged to Terrence Sterling. He arrived like a man who believed the building itself should be honored by his presence. Tall, sharp, and dressed in a black tuxedo that looked as if it had been stitched onto his body, Terrence walked into the ballroom with Bianca Hayes on his arm. Bianca had just been elevated in status around the company, and though the formal announcement had not yet happened, most people already suspected that something big was coming for her that night. She wore a fitted red gown, bold and attention-grabbing, the kind of dress that was designed not merely to be seen, but to dominate the room. Her smile was bright, triumphant, and a little too satisfied. She leaned into Terrence as though she had already claimed her place at his side, not just in the company, but in his life. Following behind them were his mother, Lorraine, and his younger sister, Shanice, both of them carrying themselves with the entitled ease of women who believed proximity to power made them powerful too. Lorraine was draped in silver blue silk and pearls, every inch of her appearance saying that she considered herself the mother of a king. Shanice wore designer arrogance as comfortably as lipstick. She moved through the room scanning faces, outfits, and reactions, always searching for someone to judge, someone to mock, or someone to remind of their lesser place. But away from the center of the room, almost hidden by the architecture of the evening, sat a woman no one important seemed to notice. Her name was Immani. She sat alone at a small table near the back of the ballroom, close enough to see everything, far enough to be treated like she was invisible. She wore a simple black dress. No diamonds, no dramatic makeup, no attempt to compete with the spectacle around her. On her lap rested a worn leather journal, held gently between both hands, as though it mattered more to her than the glittering room around her. If someone had looked at her carelessly, they might have mistaken her for an overlooked spouse, a quiet guest, a woman who had somehow wandered into a world too expensive for her. They would have seen what they expected to see: silence, softness, irrelevance. What they would not have seen was control. What they would not have understood was patience. And what none of them realized was that the most powerful person in the room was the one they had seated closest to the shadows. Terrence noticed her, of course, but not the way a husband should notice a wife. He noticed her the way powerful men notice furniture, an object already present, already claimed, already dismissed. Lorraine noticed her too, and her mouth tightened with something between irritation and amusement. She touched Shanice's arm, and the two of them changed direction. They walked toward Immani's table slowly, deliberately, the way predators approach something they believe cannot fight back. Lorraine stopped beside the table and looked down at her. "Still here?" she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I thought maybe you'd finally spare yourself the embarrassment." Shanice laughed, folding her arms. "Honestly, I'm surprised. Most women would know when it's time to disappear." Immani did not answer. She did not look up immediately either. Her fingers moved over the edge of the leather journal in her lap. Her face remained calm, unreadable, as though their words had to travel a great distance just to reach her. Lorraine leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make the cruelty feel more personal. "My son built an empire," she said, "and you still sit there looking like a sad little afterthought." Shanice tilted her head, smiling with practiced contempt. "At this point, you're not even decoration. Decoration is useful. At least decoration adds something." A few people at nearby tables pretended not to listen, but their eyes drifted over. Some looked uncomfortable, some curious, some entertained. The room was full of people who loved power, and public humiliation was one of its ugliest forms of entertainment. Still, Immani said nothing. No defense, no protest, no trembling explanation. That silence irritated them more than tears would have. Lorraine straightened and gave a small shake of her head, as if disappointed by how little sport there was in mocking someone who refused to perform pain for an audience. "Pathetic," Shanice muttered as they turned away. But if Immani heard, she gave no sign. Moments later, Terrence passed close to her table on his way toward the stage area. The anka was still on his arm, glowing with the smug warmth of a woman who believed she had already won. Terrence slowed only slightly. Then he bent toward Immani's ear and whispered 3 words. "You're nothing." It was quick, quiet, easy. The kind of cruelty that exists only because it has been practiced. Then he straightened and walked on, as if he had just adjusted his cufflinks. Bianca saw the exchange and smiled. To everyone watching from the outside, it might have looked like the final insult in a long marriage already reduced to ash. It might have looked like proof that Immani had no standing, no power, no place. But if someone had looked closely into her eyes in that moment, they would have seen something surprising. Not surrender, not defeat. Calculation. Because some people scream when they are hurt, and some people become still. Immani belonged to the second kind. A man in a gray suit approached her table from the side of the ballroom. He was older, elegant, discreet. His silver hair and measured expression gave him the quiet gravity of someone who had spent a lifetime in boardrooms, watching fortunes rise and fall. He leaned down just enough to be heard only by her. "Whenever you're ready, ma'am." Immani nodded once. He stepped away. And still, nobody noticed. Up on stage, Terrence adjusted the microphone and smiled at the room as applause rose to greet him. The spotlights found him instantly, as if the evening itself had been waiting to worship him. "Good evening," he began, his tone warm and practiced. "Tonight we celebrate not only 15 years of success, but 15 years of vision, resilience, and fearless innovation." The audience applauded again. Terrence had become very skilled at sounding like the author of achievements that were never truly his. He spoke about beginnings, about sacrifice, about strategy, about leadership. He thanked investors, employees, advisors, and key partners. He spoke in the language of ownership, the language of men who believe that repeating a lie enough times turns it into history. Then he shifted his attention toward Bianca. "And part of leadership," he said, smiling at her with a degree of admiration far too intimate for anyone paying honest attention. Is recognizing the people who will help carry that legacy forward. He extended his hand toward her. Bianca stepped onto the stage as applause rolled through the ballroom. "Tonight," Terrence continued, "I am proud to announce Bianca Hayes as the new Vice President of Operations." The room responded exactly as it was supposed to. Clapping, smiles, raised glasses. Bianca accepted the moment as if it had always belonged to her. She stood beside him, radiant and victorious, already wearing the expression of a woman imagining her future being built by another woman's stolen foundation. At her table, Immani lifted her eyes to the stage, and for a moment, everything around her dissolved. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because memory had arrived. Long before there had been a ballroom, there had been a small home in North Carolina. Before luxury hotels and corporate lies and polished betrayals, there had been a little girl with extraordinary eyes and a mother who taught her that silence was not the same thing as weakness. Immani had been raised by a school teacher who believed in discipline, dignity, and education with almost sacred conviction. Her mother was not loud. She did not command rooms by force. She did not need to. She moved with a steadiness that made chaos retreat. She taught by example that strength did not always roar. Sometimes it simply endured. Sometimes it built quietly while louder people wasted time announcing themselves. As a child, Immani showed signs early. She saw patterns where others saw confusion. Numbers made sense to her. Systems fascinated her. By the time she was in high school, teachers had stopped asking if she was gifted and started asking what planet her mind had come from. She won competitions without arrogance, solved problems older students struggled to understand, taught herself coding the way some children teach themselves songs. There was something almost frightening about the calm precision of her mind. And through it all, her mother gave her the same lesson again and again. You do not have to be the loudest person in the room to be the strongest. The night before Immani left for MIT, her mother handed her a leather journal. Simple, brown, worn-looking even then, though new. "Write your dreams here," her mother told her. "Write them down like they already belong to you." Immani promised she would. At MIT, she didn't merely survive. She emerged. The pace was brutal. The competition relentless. But challenge sharpened her rather than intimidating her. By her second year, she had begun developing a supply chain optimization system so advanced that professors spoke about it in the language reserved for breakthroughs. It could predict disruption, reroute resources, and solve inefficiencies in ways established firms had spent millions trying to achieve. What had begun as theory turned into architecture. What had begun as architecture became code. What had become code soon became a business. By 22, Immani had filed patents, secured early interest, built a company, and laid the foundation for what would later become Sterling Global Innovations. The name Sterling did not come from Terrence. It came from memory, from the silver bracelet her mother wore every day. Thin, beautiful, unbreakable. That was what Sterling meant to Immani. Not a husband's surname, not masculine authority. Strength without spectacle. She built the early company in cramped spaces. First, a dorm room glowing with computer screens and sleepless determination. Then, a tiny office where she balanced investor calls, code revisions, and legal filings with almost impossible discipline. She signed incorporation papers with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the sheer force of believing in something before the world had agreed it mattered. And slowly, it did matter. Investors noticed. Clients listened. The company began to grow. By 25, it had momentum. And somewhere in the middle of all that rising, she met Terrence. He was charming in the way some men learn to be when charm is the fastest route upward. They met at a professional event in Boston, one of those networking evenings where ambition wears perfume and everyone pretends to be slightly more successful than they are. Terrence spoke confidently, listened attentively, and made Immani feel visible in a way she had rarely experienced. He asked questions and seemed to care about the answers. He remembered details. He called when he said he would. For a woman used to being underestimated, his attention felt like recognition. They moved quickly. Dating became dependence. Dependence became marriage. And because she loved him, she trusted him. That trust would cost her nearly everything. At first, Terrence seemed supportive, proud even. He liked saying his wife was brilliant. He liked being seen beside success. But admiration in insecure people often mutates into hunger. Gradually, admiration became possession. He began calling the company ours, then more quietly, mine. When he said he felt excluded from her world, Immani tried to meet him in love rather than suspicion. She made him CFO. She gave him access, status, salary, influence. She assumed partnership would satisfy him. Instead, it educated his arrogance. He learned quickly that proximity to genius can make mediocre people look extraordinary. Investors began assuming he was central. He did not correct them. Rooms started giving him credit for strategies Immani had designed. He accepted it. At events, he introduced her not as the founder, not as the architect, not as the mind behind the empire, but as my wife. And because love can make women tolerate things that logic would reject, Immani let too much slide. By the time Sterling Global became a billion-dollar force, Terrence had grown into the lie so fully that he no longer experienced it as theft. He experienced it as entitlement. Then his family moved closer into their lives, and whatever remained of civility began to rot. Lorraine never hid her disdain for quiet women. In her mind, power belonged to men who performed it loudly, and to women who knew how to orbit that performance in glamorous support. Immani's restraint irritated her. Her intelligence threatened her. Her refusal to compete for attention looked, to someone as shallow as Lorraine, like social failure. At dinners, Lorraine criticized her clothes, her silence, her hair, her supposed inability to match Terrence's growing stature. Shanice followed her mother's lead with the loyalty of the immature. She copied the disdain, sharpened it with mockery, and treated Immani like someone fortunate merely to be tolerated in a world built by her brother. Terrence rarely defended her. That silence said more than cruelty sometimes does. The company rose higher. 5 billion. 10 billion. 25. And with each level of success, Terrence's ego grew less tethered to reality. Then Bianca arrived. She entered the company like a carefully targeted temptation. Sharp, stylish, aggressive in the polished corporate way that gets mistaken for excellence. She admired Terrence openly, laughed at his jokes, mirrored his self-image back to him until he began seeing her not as a person, but as proof of his own importance. He hired her. promoted her quickly, started staying late, then traveling, then lying more casually than before. The affair did not begin in one obvious moment. Affairs like theirs never do. They begin in glances that linger too long, in private jokes, in professional excuses used as camouflage, in subtle physical familiarity performed just below the threshold of deniability. Everyone saw it. Employees whispered. Assistants noticed hotel bookings that did not match meeting schedules. Security staff saw things in parking garages that board members never would. Lorraine adored Bianca almost immediately. "Now that," she said once during dinner, looking directly at Immani, "is a woman who understands what it means to stand beside power." Shanice agreed, of course. Terrence smiled. Immani set the table and said nothing. People mistook her silence for blindness. That was their mistake. She knew everything. She knew about the late-night meetings that were not meetings. She knew about the apartment rented downtown under a shell excuse. She knew about the messages, the trips, the receipts. Not because someone had confessed, but because Immani no longer trusted appearances. Quietly, she hired someone to document the affair. Every date, every location, every lie. And in the safe at home, near the original incorporation papers that bore only her name, she kept the evidence. Not because she wanted revenge, because she wanted truth when the time came. The final fracture happened 3 weeks before the anniversary gala. It was late. The office had mostly emptied. Immani was working in a small room few executives even knew existed when she heard voices drifting from Terrence's office down the hall. Bianca's voice came first. "When are you leaving her?" There was a pause. Then Terrence laughed softly, confidently. "Soon, once everything is secure." Immani stopped walking. The office door was slightly open. She stood just outside, unseen. "The board loves me," he said. "The investors trust me. This company is my legacy. I just need the right timing." "And her?" Bianca asked. Another laugh. "She's dead weight." Those 2 words did not wound her the way they might once have. Perhaps because by then, the wound had already scarred. Perhaps because hearing someone erase you after you built the ground beneath their feet changes pain into clarity. He went on, said she was embarrassing, invisible, useless, said he barely knew what she did all day. And standing outside that door, Immani understood something with cold, final certainty. He was never going to remember who she was. So she would have to remind him. She returned to her office, opened the leather journal her mother had given her years before, and wrote one line. "It's time." The next morning, she set things into motion. She called the board chairman. She contacted the corporate attorney she had kept quietly close for years. She reviewed ownership documents, trust structures, approvals, internal authorities. She arranged presentation material. She scheduled nothing dramatic, nothing messy, no shouting, no confrontation. Just evidence, just timing, just design. And when the gala invitation was confirmed, she requested a table in the back. She wanted everyone to look away from her one last time. Back in the ballroom, Terrence and Bianca were still soaking in applause when the lights dimmed. The room shifted. Guests turned toward the massive screen behind the stage, assuming another polished tribute video was about to begin. The sterling global logo appeared. Terrence smiled, already ready to receive admiration. Then the first slide changed everything. A photograph filled the screen. A young woman in a cramped dorm room surrounded by laptops, whiteboards, handwritten formulas, and the unmistakable atmosphere of obsession before success. Beneath the image were the words, Founder and CEO, Immani Sterling. Silence hit the room so suddenly it felt physical. Terrence's face lost its expression first, then its color. Bianca stepped back before she consciously realized she was moving. The screen continued, image after image. Immani coding the original system, Immani filing patents, Immani signing the company formation documents, Immani in early investor meetings, Immani outside the company's first real office. Then the legal evidence, articles of incorporation, patent records, corporate structures, ownership documentation. Every screen, every record, every milestone removed the company from Terrence's mouth and returned it to its rightful owner. Then came her recorded voice, calm, measured, undeniable. I built this company at 22 years old. I created the algorithm. I filed the patents. I found the investors. I hired the first employees. I named the company Sterling for my mother and for the strength she taught me to carry. No music could have been more dramatic than the sound of that truth entering the room. By the time the presentation ended, Terrence was no longer standing in triumph. He was standing in exposure. And then the ballroom saw her. Immani rose from her seat and stepped forward. The woman who had spent the evening in a simple black dress was gone. In her place walked the version of herself that should have stood publicly in power all along. She moved toward the stage in deep emerald, elegant and commanding, every detail of her presence sharpened to its rightful clarity. Her hair, once restrained, now framed her face in polished waves. Diamond earrings caught the light. Her posture was not that of someone seeking revenge. It was the posture of a woman reclaiming authorship. The room parted for her. Employees stared. Investors looked stricken. Executives began mentally revising years of assumptions in real time. Terrence watched her approach as if he were watching a ghost step out of a story he had buried. She climbed the stage steps one at a time, stopped in front of him, and without asking permission, took the microphone from his hand. He let go. That was how completely the power had shifted. When Immani spoke, she did not raise her voice. She did not need to. For 10 years, she said, I remained quiet while other people spoke over my work. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. I let you take credit. I let you reshape my story. I let your family insult me in my own home. I watched you elevate another woman inside a company you did not build. Then she looked at Terrence. And tonight, you leaned close and told me I was nothing. She let that sentence rest in the air. I was never nothing. I was everything. The words landed harder because they were true. I was the foundation. I was the vision. I was the work. I was the sacrifice. I was the person who turned an idea into a $65 billion reality. You were simply standing on what I built. Terrence tried to speak. Immani, listen. She lifted one hand. He stopped. Not because he wanted to, because he no longer had the authority to continue. Then she turned to Bianca. The vice president title you just accepted, she said evenly, requires approval beyond this stage performance. Bianca's face tightened. I am the authority behind that approval. And as of this moment, you are terminated. A murmur broke through the audience. Bianca opened her mouth, but whatever she meant to say died there. Immani had already turned back to Terrence. Your position as CFO is revoked. Your access has been suspended. Your accounts are frozen pending legal review. Security will escort you out tonight. You may retrieve your personal belongings through formal channels only. The humiliation was so complete, it almost looked unreal. Then her eyes found Lorraine. There was no anger in her face. Somehow that made it worse. The house you have been living in, Immani said, belongs to me. I purchased it before I married your son. My name is the only name on the deed. You have 30 days to vacate. Lorraine looked as though the floor had tilted beneath her. At one of the front tables, a wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered. For a second, all that remained in the room was stunned silence. Then someone started clapping. A single person, then another, until the ballroom was ringing with applause. Not polite applause, not ceremonial applause, the kind of applause people give when truth finally says out loud what everyone should have recognized years ago. Employees who had watched Immani ignored for too long stood to their feet. Women in the room looked at her with something deeper than admiration. Recognition, relief, solidarity. Investors clapped because they realized they had overlooked the real architect of the company they had funded. The board chairman stood near the front, hands calmly folded, as if he had been waiting a very long time for reality to catch up. Security appeared at the edge of the stage. Terrence turned as though searching for someone to rescue him from consequence. No one did. Bianca was escorted away in her red dress, no longer looking glamorous, only exposed. Terrence followed, moving like a man whose internal map of the world had just been set on fire. Phones came out. Whispers spread. Industry mythology was being rewritten in real time. And at the center of it all stood Immani, not screaming, not trembling, not triumphant in any childish way. Just true. The aftermath was immediate. By the time Terrence tried to use his company cards, they had been deactivated. His leased luxury car disappeared the next morning. Calls from influential contacts turned cold. Messages arrived not with support, but with distance. People in power understand scandal instinctively. They move away from fraud faster than they move toward talent. Within days, the network Terrence had spent years cultivating through borrowed prestige had begun collapsing around him. Bianca's fall was equally sharp. No serious company wanted the scandal attached to her name. Everyone in the industry had heard some version of the story by then. The executive mistress publicly promoted by a man who did not own the company, only to be fired by the woman who did. Doors closed quickly. Calls were not returned. Opportunities evaporated. For all her ambition, Bianca had built her climb on somebody else's theft. And once that theft was exposed, there was nothing solid beneath her. Lorraine tried outrage first, then denial, then legal threats. None of them helped. The eviction notice arrived exactly as promised. 30 days, no extensions. Shanice complained online about loyalty and betrayal, but those words sounded hollow coming from someone who had spent years humiliating the woman now revealed to be the source of every comfort they had enjoyed. The social circles that once welcomed them grew quieter. Invitations stopped. Calls slowed. People who once laughed at their comments suddenly had other plans. It turns out, ridicule is easiest when truth is hidden. Once exposed, the whole performance curdles. 3 months after the gala, Terrence returned to Sterling Global headquarters. not as an executive, as a man locked out of the life he had mistaken for his own. He stood in the lobby, looking thinner, duller, stripped of his former glow of certainty. Security stopped him before he could go farther. He argued at first, insisted he only needed 5 minutes, said there had to be some mistake. There wasn't. Through the glass, he could see the upper conference level, and there, at the head of a boardroom table, stood Immani, speaking, directing, owning. Every person in the room focused on her with the respect that had always been due. Maybe it was the first time in years that Terrence truly saw her, not as his wife, not as an extension of himself, not as silence mistaken for weakness, but as the woman who had loved him when he was ordinary, elevated him when he did not deserve it, and lost him only when he mistook grace for permission. Security escorted him out, and that was the end of it. Immani did not go looking for revenge beyond truth. She did not spend her days tracking their suffering or feeding on public sympathy. She had more important things to do. The company had to be stabilized. Markets had reacted nervously at first, as markets do whenever leadership drama erupts. But Immani addressed it with precision. She stepped into public view on her own terms and gave her first major interview in years. She spoke calmly, factually, without melodrama. She explained the founding, clarified ownership, reaffirmed vision. And in doing so, she reminded the world that the company had always been safest in the hands of the person who created it. The response was overwhelming. Not just because the story was sensational, but because it touched something painfully familiar for many people. Women across industries saw themselves in her. The invisible labor, the stolen credit, the assumption that quiet means weak. The cultural habit of handing authority to the louder person in the room, especially if that louder person is male and charming. Immani became more than a CEO reclaiming a company. She became proof. Proof that patience is not passivity. Proof that silence can be discipline. Proof that truth does not require dramatics to destroy a lie. Sterling Global recovered, then rose stronger. Internally, Immani reshaped the company culture. Promotions began to favor substance over performance. Loyal, competent people who had spent years overlooked by louder opportunists were given room to grow. She established mentorship programs for young women in STEM, especially Black women navigating the same invisibility she had known so intimately. She spoke at conferences, but not about gossip, about innovation, systems, leadership, integrity. And every time she stood on a stage now, she did so in her full name, in her full authority, with no one left to stand in front of her and translate her power into someone else's story. Months later, she drove back to North Carolina, back to the small town where her mother had once told her that quiet strength moves mountains. She visited the cemetery with the leather journal in her hands. The same journal, still worn, still precious, still carrying the handwriting of a younger woman who once wrote dreams into paper because her mother asked her to believe in them before the world did. Immani knelt at the grave and placed the journal down gently. For a while, she said nothing. Then she spoke as if her mother were still close enough to hear the shape of her voice. "I built it, Mama," she whispered. "I built what we wrote down." The wind moved lightly through the grass. She touched the stone. "I lost myself for a while," she said. But I found my way back. There is a kind of grief that never really leaves. It only changes clothes. It becomes memory. It becomes guidance. It becomes the voice in your chest that reminds you who you are when the world gets loud enough to make you forget. Immani stayed there a long time. Long enough to remember not just pain, but beginnings. Long enough to feel gratitude rise higher than betrayal. Long enough to understand that reclaiming power is not only about taking back what was stolen. Sometimes it is about returning to the version of yourself that existed before you agreed to become smaller for someone else's comfort. When she finally stood, she was lighter. Not because the past had disappeared, because it no longer owned the future. On her way out, a young woman approached her nervously, carrying a portfolio and wearing the uncertain determination of someone just beginning to imagine a bigger life. "Miss Sterling," she said, "I heard you speak last month. I just wanted to thank you." Immani smiled gently. "For what?" The young woman swallowed. "For showing people like me that we don't have to be loud to matter." Immani looked at her for a moment. Then she said the words her mother might once have said to her. "You were never waiting to become powerful. You already were." The young woman left with tears in her eyes. Immani watched her go and understood something beautiful in that moment. Pain had not ended with her, but neither would strength. Later, she bought a smaller house on the coast, not because she needed to hide, because she no longer needed spectacle. Mornings there were simple: wind off the water, coffee on the porch, sunrise over the shoreline, space to think, space to breathe, space to write in a new journal, one not filled with dreams waiting to happen, but with lessons, gratitude, and the hard-earned peace that comes after surviving the collapse of illusion. People still asked her, sometimes in interviews, whether she would ever trust again, whether she would ever love again, whether betrayal had made her hard. Her answer remained steady. "I never stopped believing in people. I just learned to believe in myself more." That was the difference. She no longer needed to be seen by those committed to misunderstanding her. She no longer begged recognition from people who benefited from her silence. She no longer mistook endurance for obligation. She had learned that you cannot force someone to honor your worth if their power depends on ignoring it. And she had learned something even more important. The quietest person in the room is not always the weakest. Sometimes she is simply the one with the least to prove. Sometimes she is the one holding the evidence. Sometimes she is the one who built the stage everyone else is standing on. And sometimes, when the moment is right, she does not need revenge. She only needs the truth. Because truth, delivered at the exact right moment, can collapse an empire built on arrogance faster than rage ever could. Terrence had called her nothing. But what destroyed him was discovering, far too late, that she had always been everything. And that is the danger of underestimating a quiet woman. By the time you finally realize who she is, the story no longer belongs to you. It belongs to her.